Okay, good evening, everyone. Just want to make sure that I'm being heard loud and clear.
Out of 5.
Yes,
Okay,
Chelsea,
great.
yes.
Great. So thank you very, very much to each and every one of you for joining. Let's unpack it here today for our Youth Advocacy in Action, our webinar series, episode 1. We will get to know each other a bit later on, so I wouldn't ask you to introduce yourselves, but I just really want to thank you all for joining, for accepting our invitation today. So before we get into the good stuff, we're gonna have a little icebreaker. So this requires everyone to participate. You don't all have to turn on your cameras, but if you can, that would be nice. So for the icebreaker, we're gonna introduce ourselves. So say our name, our favorite hobby, and a word that describes us. But the word must begin with the first letter of our name. Got that? So our name, our favorite hobby, and a word that describes us, but it must begin with the first letter of your name. So for me, it'll be Chelsea. My favorite hobby, I would say right now, is collecting foreign currency. And don't laugh, David. And the word I would use would be, say, cheerful. So cheerful Chelsea. So it has to begin with the first letter of your name. So you can begin, or I can call names. Persons don't like when people start to call names. So if anyone wants to go, you can do that. If not, I can just start calling names.
Carl,
Okay,
conservative and cute. Oh, sorry, I think Melissa was going first, Ben.
No, go ahead.
Carl, conservative and cute. 2 C's. There you go.
So
And the
what is
hobby,
your
Carl.
hobby?
Oh, yes, it was the hobby that was supposed to begin with C.
So eager to describe himself in such.
I'm just saying. A hobby beginning with C. Does eating begin with a C? Let's say
A hobby doesn't have to begin with C. Just any hobby, Carl.
Any hobby.
Culinary stuff. Culinary stuff.
And by that, folks, he means that he drives his car and goes to the nearest mini mart and to buy what they have.
Because I've never heard of Apple cooking. I've heard of
That's
him
why I changed
things to cook, but
culinary stuff. So anything to do with eating or food, I would say yes.
okay. Thank you very much, sir. Who'll be next? Lexan?
Okay, hi everybody. I'm Lexan. I guess one of my favorite hobbies is watching TV, and the word to describe me would be loyal.
Okay, loyal Lexan. That's good. That's good. Who'll be next?
All right, I'll go. Hi, everybody. My name is David. My favorite hobby is to go hiking or exploring outdoors. And I think a good word to describe me is dependable.
Okay, dependable David. Thank you. Who'll be next?
I can go ahead. Hi, everyone. Lovely to meet you. My name is Danielle Walwyn, and I am an avid podcast listener. Not sure if we have any other podcast listeners on the call. And I would say dancer Danielle. So I'm a Zumba instructor and love any music beat playing. You'll find me moving. Nice to meet everyone.
Nice. Thank you, dancer Danielle. Okay, let's keep the ball going.
I guess I'll go. Hi, I'm Khadija, everyone. I am my hobbies are writing poetry, and I guess I would say kind Khadija, because that's the only K word I can really think of right now. Yeah, it's nice to meet all of you, and I'm looking forward to today's session.
Thank you, kind Khadija.
Hi, I'm gonna go in behind kind. Oh, sorry, I'm gonna go in behind kind Khadija. I am not in any category of youth in here, but I'm Khadijah's mommy, so I sign on and I follow your pages all the time. So I signed on to give you guys support. So I would say my hobby is going to the beach. And I think you guys are doing very excellent work. or I would describe myself as selfless. Selfless Sakina.
Selfless. I don't. The name just disappeared.
Sakina.
Shakina. Okay, thank you, and thank you very much for your support. Selfless Shakina. Who will be next? Okay, I don't think I heard.
I can go next.
Go ahead.
Hi everyone, my name is Simone Bishop Matthews. Hobby, I would say I like to bake, and I'm kind of dabbling in cooking more vegan or plant-based food options. An adjective to describe myself, with S, maybe let's say smart, for lack of a better word.
Okay, smart Simone. Thank you for being here. Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Shania Batiste. One of my hobbies is to try out new food recipes, and a word to describe myself would be spontaneous Shania.
Spontaneous Shania. And she's a good baker, y'all. Okay, I'm seeing some persons in here who don't seem to want to talk, but I'm going to call a name. I see Wafel's iPhone. Then we have Senery. We haven't heard Senery. And Narisa. So you're the last three.
Good afternoon. My name is Narisa. I love to read. And what I would say for my adjective is novel.
Novel Narisa. Thank you for joining us. Okay, last two. Yes, Wafel, go ahead. It's your hand up. Okay, that may have been a mistake. Okay.
I don't think it's working for her. Yeah.
Oh, okay. And okay, Sari may not be there. Okay, well, thank you all for participating. Sorry, go ahead. Okay. Go ahead, Sen.
Oh, sorry. No, I missed the initial part. So could you remind me?
So it's your name, a favorite hobby, and then a word describing you, but it must begin with the first letter of your name.
Oh, that's tough. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Seneri. My favorite hobby would be exercising, going to the gym, running, etc. Word that would describe me with S would be sensitive.
Sensitive Seneri. Okay. Okay. Nice to meet you, sensitive Seneri. And for Rachel, if you want, you can type it in the chat so that we don't miss your introduction. But yeah, so before we get into it, if you have any questions, you can just send a DM to the Let's Unpack It Zoom chat, not the one that says David first, the one that actually says let's unpack it, so that the messages don't get lost in the chat. Then we have our Q&A section. So first up, we have Mr. Carl Applewaite. He graduated from UWI Cave with a Bachelor's of Arts degree, and then proceeded to the private sector where he worked in management as a human resources officer for one of Barbados's leading aircraft handling companies. It was his realization that many young persons were failing during the interview process, and his intention to empower youth. And it was his intention to empower youth that led him to pursue a career within the education sector. Within 10 years, he achieved his diploma in education, certificate in education management and administration, and his master's in education, social context, and policy. At present, he is a sixth form year head at Harrison College, where he is responsible for providing a platform for students to transition from secondary to tertiary education and from adolescence to adulthood. He has an unwavering passion for the developmental aspect of education, for education, sorry. To this end, he also formed the Barbados Debating Society and is a board member of the Childcare Board and facilitates numerous leadership and personal development training sessions for adult and youth. He realizes, however, that the youth can only fulfill their full potential if they are provided with the necessary supports to understand themselves and the world around us. Without further ado, Mr. Carl Applewhite.
Thank you very much, Chelsea. I obviously have to start with the new catchphrase. Can you all hear me now? Can you hear me clearly?
5 out of 5, yes, sir.
Okay, and I can share my screen, right? Yes, I can. So I am sharing the screen with everyone so that we can see the presentation from the beginning. So, thank you, David, Chelsea, and all the other members of the Let's Unpack It group. I have to put on my glasses to see what I am doing to make sure that I get it from the right slide. It is an honor to be asked to do this presentation. And as Chelsea would have said, yes, I do have the passion for development, the development of youth. And to this end, this is what makes the session so pertinent to me. So team dynamics and building, certainly for the Let's Unpack It, I'm sure you all would have established or encountered numerous dynamics so far because we've been in operation for a number of years so far. And there are also other organizations or institutions for which persons may be here representing. So we start, and I would like to start with the premise or the question: what is a team? What constitutes a team? What's the definition of team? So when we hear team building and dynamics, to what are we referring? And I start on that premise, and I have the definition here for you, that a team is defined as a group of people who perform interdependent tasks to work towards accomplishing or completing a common mission or specific objective. Two things I want persons to know there. One, there's a common mission and there's a specific objective. So everybody really is getting on board to go to one particular destination or for one reason. So that is the commonality from which everybody agrees and comes together. You are in agreement as to where you should go. And the other thing I want to bring to your attention is that it says a group of persons or a group of people. It should be persons because you're looking at individuals. So you're looking at numerous individuals, which implies a number of different personalities. And it said right there that they're focusing or doing interdependent tasks, which means that everybody's not working or operating as a man or woman on his own or an island on his own, but every person's contribution or task is dependent on another person's task within that same group. And that's what complicates things. So although everyone is going towards the same destination or has that goal in mind, we are reliant on other persons to achieve said goal. The other thing I would like to start with, the premise I would like to start with, is why do you need a team in the first instance? I think it should be a given, because we all know we are living in an increasingly interdependent world. We heard the word globalization tossed about, and that in itself suggests that we are coming together as one. We're no longer existing as separate countries, island states. I dare say, even from a foreign policy perspective, that whole nationalistic foreign policy perspective is being rejected or should be rejected if we're looking at advancing. So why we need a team is because we need collaborative problem solving, and that leads to better outcomes. Collaborative meaning that we need, as I said before, we need each other. And when you have more than one idea, inevitably, it leads to a better decision being made. Because I am sure that persons here would be on teams, And you may come to a meeting, a session, whatever the program, whatever the event may be, and you are convinced that your particular solution or idea is the key to advancing a cause. And then when you engage in dialogue with other persons, intentionally or unintentionally, you realize there's a piece that you can take from somebody and somebody else said something else. And when you bring all of them together, you get a better outcome than that which you originally went into the meeting with which you went into the meeting. So there is the need to collaborate, and I would have said, either intentionally or unintentionally, if we're to get what is known as best practice or the best outcome possible. So when we're talking about the team building and the dynamics, one of the things we have, you'll see a structure here on the screen, and it shows leadership, and it shows one person at the top, or individuals at the top, and then you have persons at the bottom. And I really want to use this opportunity to disabuse persons of the notion, and this may be controversial, that a team does not need a leader. I've remembered the phrase, even a pin has a head. And without a leader, I dare say that the entire team is being compromised, because at the end of the day, there has to be a person or persons around whom the others coalesce, or who is ultimately responsible or accountable for taking that particular team forward, for executing that vision. Now, that does not mean that person is the sole individual. It's a shared responsibility. But the buck must stop, to use colloquialism, the buck must stop at someone. And that's why we need a leader. What else do we need? There are some characteristics that must be enshrined in building that team or in executing tasks as we go forward. Now, there are about 8 or 9 items I would identify here. But beyond that, I'm going to look at an acronym that I hope persons would have known or heard of by now. So we need a couple of things. We need some clearly defined goals. And when we say clearly defined, we are referring to organizational. So we need to know what the organization's goals are. And then we need to know what are the specific projects within the organization. Because certainly within the organization, there are going to be specific projects that will come up from time to time, and each project is not going to have the same goal. So yes, the organization has an overarching objective, but when you break it down into the projects, each project has a different outcome. And for that, you need to identify what are the goals for the various projects, and how do these feed in, or do they feed in to the organization's overarching goals. Secondly, you need clearly defined roles. That I would have alluded to the need for a leader previously. There need to be, when you identify the goals, you need to identify who is responsible for executing particular tasks. I'm going to get to the acronym later. We're going to see why it is critical, because very often we get on the boat, and I'll use this analogy, we get on the boat, we all want to cross the river to get to a particular destination. Nobody knows who is going to row. Nobody knows who is going to put the gas in the engine if it is a speedboat, for example. No one knows who is going to be the navigator, and then that leads or sets the foundation for, I say, chaos. They also need to be team rules. And these are, I know Let's Unpack It has referred to them by their social media platforms. They've referred to them as boundaries in some instances, but there are rules. So every person operates and understands that they're operating within particular parameters, and they cannot exceed these particular parameters. And that goes not only for the persons who are executing tasks, that goes from the top, and I use the word top very loosely in terms of from the leader, right down to the persons, the remainder of the persons within the organization. And in order to do and to understand these rules, we need to have, that brings us to the next point, open communication. And open communication is a two-way street. There has to be the avenue for the leader to express his or her vision to the members on the team, and vice versa. There has to be provision and opportunity for persons on the team to express their opinion to the persons who are leading. And only when we have that collaboration will we realize that we have the communication that is necessary to achieve, or at least to understand that everybody is going in the correct direction. And let me use the analogy of rowing in the boat again. The navigator certainly would be unwise to sit and realize that the boat is going east when the direction you want to go is west. And he or she is not going to express his opinion or that fact unless he is comfortable or she is comfortable in expressing his opinion. So the open communication must be there, allowing for persons to, the next point, trust. So there must be that element of trust. Persons must trust each other to be willing to express themselves. And even if they express themselves and there's a difference in opinion, to understand that it is this difference of opinion that adds, in some instance, some flavor to the ride. And you bear in mind that although there are differences in opinion, what is the organization's overarching goal? And you can even liken this to political parties. I dare say in any cabinet across the region to the United States, in any democracy, every cabinet or government has the particular and overarching objective. But that's not to say that cabinet members don't have different versions and perspectives, as to how this shall be achieved. I even say that different parties, different political parties may have the same objective. I don't think that in a democracy you would find a political party that does not have the best interest of the people at heart. But what distinguishes one party from another is the way in which this is achieved. And to me, that should, not only to me, but to persons, it is when we stick to slavishly to those politics that we prevent there being any true advancement in terms of achieving the goals that we would want for the betterment of the people. There must also be shared accountability. I would have alluded to that before, where we talked about, yes, there are leaders and there are persons who assist in executing the tasks, and there's mutual decision making. So when you have that open communication, I don't want persons to think that to have the open communication, once you express your opinion, that is it. Your opinion goes towards something. It goes towards the decision that is eventually made. So you don't want to be expressing yourself, or you don't want a team that allows persons to express themselves and the decision does not reflect the will of the people. Let me be a little bit controversial here at the present moment. Supreme Court recently made a decision in the United States, Roe versus Wade, and dependent on, regardless of what your opinion may be, the President of the United States is for the rights of females, and females having the right, obviously, to choose and having the right for over their body. The Senate is in favor of that. The Congress is in favor of that. And polls show that 80-something% of Americans are in favor of that. So then what is happening when 6 individuals make a decision that goes contrary to all those branches of government that I articulated or identified and the will of the people? It suggests that there's something in the decision making, and this is now for the Supreme Court to examine themselves, and certainly for the United States to examine the functioning and the role of the Supreme Court, even the constitution of it. And that, because that decision making, yes, they're leaders, but it shows there is a flaw in that decision making where the people's will is not being upheld in these decisions. And finally, we need a bold leader. We need someone who is going to stand up and speak regardless of the consequences. And when I say regardless of the consequences, I mean a person who has the interests and the best interests of the people at heart and who is doing this. Because I am sure a person, and we don't want to call other political names that are non-dictator, but in a non-democracy, I am sure the individuals think that they are being bold by standing up for particular beliefs, but the reality is the beliefs do not reflect the will of the people. So in being bold, you have to remember the rule that we talked about before in terms of the mutual decision-making and the need to have the open communication. So that boils down to ensuring every organization, when you set your goals, should have these, and this is what I hope that LUI will know by now, certainly after being in existence for a number of years, and any institution that is worth its salt would know. SMART. We say that all goals should be SMART. And what do we mean by SMART? And it's right there for us to look at. This is the acronym that the SMART goals, our goals, mean they should be specific, they should be measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. And you would have heard me talk about the need to have goals before, previously. So if we pull one, like, for example, measurable, this is why we need to have clear articulation of team members' roles, because we need to be able to measure whether or not we are being successful. So LUI, have you been successful over the past year? What objectives have you put in place? Metrics are you using to determine your success? Are you looking at the number of, for example, are you looking at the number of persons that may have liked the page or follow the page? Are you looking at the number of persons, the attendance at workshops? Or are you looking at the level of engagement from persons in terms of direct messaging or shares? But what metrics are put in place that you can measure to determine that a year ago or today you are better off than you were a year ago? And who is responsible for that? Who is responsible for that growth? And that's why I would have said earlier that we need to identify specific roles for persons so that they're measurable. And that is part of it being specific. We need teams, and I am part of a team as well. We need to be specific in what we are achieving. We don't, can we use an analogy? We don't just want to eliminate poverty. We want to reduce poverty by 30%. What does that mean? That means we've identified the specific goal. It is specific, no, that's redundancy. It is specific 30%. But that means that we have to identify a level. What do we determine as impoverished at present? And how many persons exist within that particular category. So that within, and that's where we look at the T, time bound, we put a time to it, within X amount of time, we can look back and measure and we can see we started with 100 persons at this threshold, and after 6 months, we're at 90. Was that the specific goal that was set? And if it was not, there's nothing wrong with, I use the term loosely, failure. It means you did not meet your initial objective. And part of the dynamics of a team means you're constantly reviewing your objectives if they are not attainable or if you do not attain your particular objectives. So you're living in a fluid environment. So you may constantly have changing objectives and you're reviewing them to see if they are actually being met. So specific, measurable, and that's when you do your research, there must be some percentage or some metric instrument by which you can measure your results. Realistic, you want to, again, don't overextend yourselves. It is always better to start small. You think big, but start small so you exceed expectations. This works for you, and it also works for the persons on the outside because they can see that you have exceeded that which you started with. And time bound. So as I said, you must put a specific time frame to them so that you can measure them accurately. Now, when we look at dynamics of the teams, we're going to find there's always conflict. We have task-based conflict identified before, task-based conflict, leadership-based, work style, and personality-based. Now, task-based refers to persons not being sure of what their specific task is, and that generates the specific conflict. And we're going to look at resolving those conflicts, of course. Leadership base means the style, and this comes in, and this is when I encourage you to do the Myers-Briggs personality test or any other personality test that you find appropriate, that your style may not necessarily merge with the members on your team. And if it doesn't, it means that, remember that open communication, you will know because they will trust that you will be open to hearing a different perspective. And when you hear the different perspective, it's up to you to do the necessary introspection to determine if your leadership style is indeed causing and creating tension within the particular group. Work style. So similarly, the same way leaderships have a work ethic and a work style, workers do. And you may find that some workers may be slow and methodical, almost like a perfectionist. And then you know that there are the other ones who are, I don't want to use the word rash, but they're the ones who are a little bit more energetic, the go-getters. As soon as it is given, they're at the task and doing it the same time. The energy levels are different. Does not mean that one person is putting in more work than the other. It just means the style is different. And so you have to be aware of the different styles that exist within your organization, within your group, within your team, so that when you see it, you know that the person is not shirking, that the person is not being bossy. It is that person's style of doing it, and you look for ways so that the styles can merge and work together for the betterment of everyone. And then, of course, there's the personality base, because as I said in the beginning, when we looked at the definition of team, because we're individuals, we each bring to the table different perspectives, experiences, and beliefs. So when we have that personality-based conflict, it is to identify, is this a problem with the task? Is this a problem with the person? And if it's a problem with the person, one of the things we're going to look at is we're trying not to use and give personal criticism. But that's something we're going to look at when we get to the solutions, which is the next slide. We look at criticizing the technique, not necessarily the person. And there's a difference between the two of those. So rather than you're doing this too slow, you have the other perspective where you can say the task is not being achieved quick enough. Same effect, but you are not calling out somebody. The person does not feel accused. You're not triggering someone in terms of making them feel totally responsible. So then how do we resolve these conflicts? And again, we have a couple of them. One, remain calm. I remember somebody once told me, why do you breathe so shallow? I will never forget that somebody told me that on board the aircraft. And that was a signal to me that I needed to be more calm, because somehow I was taking short breaths and I needed to inhale and exhale slowly. And that not only would control me in normal circumstances, but it will help me to maintain control under pressure and in tense situations. And tense situations. Listen. The first thing you have to do is listen, and listen to hear, not, and this is the cliche, you don't listen to respond. You may not know what the person is going to say, and it is because you are listening to respond that you are hearing, but you're not listening. So you're hearing what the person is saying, but in your mind, you're already calculating and predetermining what you are going to say. So it means that you've missed what the exact problem is, and you've not heard the issue that the person is trying to share with you. And that is part of the next point, which is the communication, that you need to be communicating with persons in order to identify when problems arise and know when problems arise and be able to fix them. And as we talk about communication, we acknowledge them. Problems will occur. That's the one thing on which Obama said, use the word prognosticate. We'll never forget it since then. That's the one thing on which I could prognosticate. Problems will occur. And in the words of the former Prime Minister, we need to face it and we need to fix it. What exacerbates these problems is when we don't acknowledge them and they're left to fester, or we acknowledge them, but we still don't do anything about them. Having or experiencing problems does not result or does not mean that you're a failure. It just simply means just that there is a problem. And when you have the problem, you fix it. And when the problem is over, that is it. So the work of the organization and institution continues, but we don't like the conflict. We don't like the tension. We don't like to acknowledge that we may have failed, if it is a failure indeed. And finally, this is the point that I wanted to make earlier, I was alluding to. Take criticism seriously, but don't take it personally. Take criticism seriously, do not take it personally. And as you are in your teams, I would like you to think of persons who are leaders and what they have gone through, and see if you could have been in that position yourself, in leadership positions, and see if you could have been in that position yourself. So if you're a leader now in any organization, or you're seeking to, measure yourself against a person, one of your role models, and see how you would have handled that. One of mine tends to be Hillary Clinton. And certainly persons, I don't think, regardless of what your political perspective may be, persons cannot doubt her strength or her tenacity, because this is a lady who experienced infidelity in front of the world and continued. This is a lady who was in the 2016 elections against Donald Trump and who was vilified, whose words have come out to be true at this point in time, but she persisted. And I can go on and go on. And I say that to say that I realize she embodies a sense of strength and self that I don't know many of us have. And I dare say in some instances, I probably would cower and run away from in these instances. So you have to take it seriously and not personally. And then I would just end by asking you, what are your issues? So when you look at yourself in a team, or you look at your team, what are the issues that you're facing right now? Are there issues with your leader? Are there issues with your fellow co-workers, your fellow teammates? What are the issues? Where do the problems fall? Are there problems? Is the problem with you? I want you to examine that, do the necessary introspection, and see if there's any way that you can use one of the conflict resolution skills or one of the ways to identify the problems, and then that would help to break it down. How do we eat an elephant one bite at a time, and help to put things in perspective by realigning yourself to realize we're all in this together. We all got into this organization for the same reason. We sat down and we have an overarching objective. We just have different perspectives as to how we get there. And that's how I started, and that is how I wanted to end this afternoon's session. I think we open up now to Q&A, right, Chelsea?
Yeah, most definitely. Thank you so much, Mr. Applewitt, for what was indeed a very insightful presentation. As you were speaking, I was analyzing our team and matching some of the things that we do within our team. And of course, some things that we definitely need to work on at Let's Unpack It. I'd like to open to anyone now who has any questions. Feel free to send me a DM or just message in the chat. Any questions that you have for Mr. Applewitt. But just to get the ball rolling, Mr. Applewitt, I have about 3 questions that I wrote down from what you would have asked. And let's start where you left off with the idea of conflict resolution. I know for us at Let's Unpack It, we have for these last 2 years been entirely online. And so I think one of the challenges for me as a leader in particular is, how do I motivate the team? How do I deal with the issues that arise in an online environment? We know that nonverbal cues, for instance, are very much missing in terms of communicating online. And so I wonder if there are any kind of recommendations that you have for those who are similar to us in terms of navigating conflict and moving towards conflict resolution in an online environment.
Incidentally, I think the online environment helps with conflict resolution in that you cannot pick up some of the intensity from the nonverbal communication. So that kind of I don't want to say it nullifies it, but it definitely softens it somewhat, for sure. On the other hand, the converse, or conversely, you're not able to pick up on things that you would have picked up on were you in person. So I would encourage persons to, rather than send the emails where tone can override the content of what is trying to be communicated, do video calls, because the video calls would allow you to manage the two. Someone can then have the benefit of picking up on the nonverbal cues, but still it softens it. So if it is something for which you're passionate, your passion could come across, but not the aggression. Or if the aggression comes across, who knows, that may be a flaw that was unseen before, but now someone is able to identify it. So although we are in an online format, I would encourage persons to use more video calling, and even calling as opposed to texting. Texting leaves so much room for error and missing. So this is just, that just triggered me all over. Texting leaves too much room for misinterpretation. Then you can just pick up the phone and avoid an entire argument, misunderstanding, misinterpretation, and you can hear the person's tone and realize that something is not intended or something was intended. So please, let's hear your voice, or let's see you, and we can do that with the technology.
We'll take that point, and I definitely agree. It's always better to converse and to mimic that kind of in-person communication rather than doing things via text. The second question for you, Ms. Apwit, you mentioned earlier the idea of trust and building trust, and we know that building trust takes time. Let's use the example of a youth group, a youth organization like Let's Unpack It, where, as you would know, the majority of our grouping, we never really met in person or really collaborated in person before. How do you then build that level of trust when you have people coming from different backgrounds, different areas, and perhaps they weren't able to meet up in person and to collaborate in that sense? Any tips there for how to build trust in that kind of environment?
Truth or dare, and to know someone like, though I say so facetiously, but because you're really not there in person, it goes back to the point I would have made earlier about communication. Although you are not, we have persons who exist and successfully so in long distance. Okay, so although you are not there in person, the communication between you, once it is regular, it is going to build that trust. Because when you're talking to an individual, or communicating, I should say, with an individual, and you're doing so regularly, certainly at some point in time, there is going to be some subtopic that is not particularly related to LUI, and you're going to begin to engage. And once you begin to engage in that one topic, you don't know where that's going to take you. So the more you communicate, the more regularly you communicate, the closer you become. This is a warning sign. From the time communication begins to diminish, you're going to realize persons go in their separate ways, because you're no longer sharing individual goals or organizational goals or even task-related goals. So you need to make sure that even from an organizational perspective, there's always that discussion about the organization, about planning, in charting the way forward, the goals. As I said, there's always some aspect about those SMART objectives that you can discuss. And out of that becomes a personal touch in which you all can identify and make that bond. And there are activities. So I said so facetiously at the beginning, but certainly there are activities that will build trust with individuals.
That's really good. It sounds like definitely, as Kobe said in the chat, we need to have an LUI summit. We definitely need to do some more games and activities, and perhaps Mr. Apwit will come back to us and do a team building exercise.
No.
Get that underway. Yeah, I did have one more question. Is there any? Are there any questions from the chat, guys? Anything you guys were ready to answer? If not, I'd go ahead. Yes. Okay. I think
don't have my
Mums has put
glasses, so
me.
I can't see what the messages are.
Mums has put me on the spot here. So one of the things that we have thought about as LUA in terms of our number of meetings, for example, because we realize that LUA is an extracurricular activity, we realize that people get busy and so on, we're thinking of reducing our number of meetings, okay? In terms of discussing business as regularly, as often as that.
How often do you meet?
Typically, we met every single week on Sundays to prep for the week in advance. But we're thinking, you know what? Maybe it's not absolutely necessary. Maybe we can do this in 2 weeks. Do you think that's a reasonable idea if we were able to maintain the level of business that we typically discuss in 4 weeks? Does that, for instance, negate the ideas that you're promoting in terms of building trust and communication?
Not at all. I think that's actually the idea is to work smart, not hard. That's actually, I can't remember the word you call it now. That was a pun unintended, because when you're working smart, all of those things that we just identified you're using. So if you go in 2-week tranches, all you're already doing is taking these same goals, identifying the goals, the persons for whom we're responsible, you're only adjusting your T, which is the time frame in which it's going to be done. So you definitely, and the specific objective may be more. So rather than a person having one thing to do within that week, it may be that they have 2, but certainly they know that when it has to occur, what time, and what specifically has to happen. And because you're not meeting does not mean that you're not communicating, because you still have the email there by which you can just email and you can just drop a message to remind someone if you didn't see it up at a particular time, or even just to prompt them, don't forget tomorrow 3 o'clock is XYZ. So we are working smart, as I said, pun intended. The time bound is the only aspect there that will be affected. So by all means, 2 weeks as opposed to 1, but the communication will still be occurring.
Yeah, and in response to that, we're seeing a lot of advice coming from our next 2 panelists and guest speakers here in terms of the tools that they utilize. Thank you so much, Mr. Applewhite. I will invite anyone who has any other kind of questions, you can send them to us. We'll forward them to Mr. Applewhite, and I'm sure he'd be willing to respond, and we will get back to you with that. We have a gift for you, Mr. Applewhite. It's nothing too fancy. But in recognition of your attendance here and giving us a wonderful presentation, which I hope you'll make available to us so that we can share with our fellow advocates and activists and so on. Just again, very, very happy that you accepted our offer to present this evening and for giving us such insight into what we can do to better our team and improve our team dynamics. Thanks again so much, Carl.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David and Chelsea and the whole team.
Yeah. All righty. Over to you, Chelsea.
I couldn't find my mic for a second. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Applewhite. And thank you for all who would have given your input and sending your questions. So next up, we have Ms. Roshana Trim. Ms. Roshana Trim believes strongly in the power of youth to create change and lives by the words of Barbadian-born Shirley Chisholm, who became the first African-American congresswoman who said, "If they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair." Born in Guyana, raised in Barbados, Roshana Trim is a passionate Caribbean advocate with a keen interest in civic participation and development with young people as active creators and partners. Roshana has been involved in youth-led organizations for over 8 years and served as the Prime Minister of the Barbados National Youth Parliament for the period 2014 to 2017. She is the first woman to chair the Caribbean Regional Youth Council and is the president of the Barbados Youth Development Council. In 2019, she co-founded the Pink Parliament Initiative, which aims to increase the number of women in Parliament by providing mentorship to girls ages 14 to 20. She is the 2019 IMF youth fellow, and a recent graduate of the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus, having read for a Bachelor's of Science in International Relations. In 2021, she led the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. That's 15, yes, X and V, 15 Youth Forum. Roshana believes in the power of community to drive progress because everyone has the potential to drive change. We now welcome Ms. Roshana Trim.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much, Chelsea. So I'm just going to take a moment right quickly to share my screen and get right into it. Okay, sorry, I got a bit rusty.
Yeah, you should have it now. Yeah.
All right.
It should be something green at the bottom of your screen.
Yeah. I see it. Let me just get there right now. All right. So present. So can everybody see my screen? So I'm sorry, I'm a little stuffy, just from traveling, but I really thought it was important to be here because this is definitely a very important discussion, a very important sessions by Let's Unpack It. So thanks a lot, David and Chelsea and the entire team. So in starting and running an organization, I think the best place to start is advocacy and the why and the who. And so my presentation is really on the importance of advocacy and how you can add value as you begin to start your organization. And the reason I've taken this route is because there are a lot of tools, particularly in Barbados, that tell you exactly how to start and run an organization on the administrative side. What we take for granted is that persons particularly understand the other side of it isn't the administrative side, but more so the things that are intrinsic to running an organization and when to use advocacy and when not to use advocacy. So you know me, my name is Roshana Trim, and Chelsea's giving you quite a bit about me. So we're just going to get right into it. And so we're talking today about what is advocacy, what is policy, why and when advocacy, benefits of advocacy, key skills for advocacy, planning your advocacy journey. And I want to speak very quickly about Ubuntu and how that adds to it, and then just quickly get into a discussion. Why is advocacy important? What are some of the key components to consider? And so this section really provides you with an understanding of how advocacy works and the key questions you should consider before jumping in. So why is advocacy important? And advocacy is important simply because it gives persons the chance to create the change that they want to see. John Daly described advocacy as persuading people who matter to care about your issues. It's about getting listened to, being at the table when decisions are made, being heard by people who make decisions, and it's about facing and overcoming resistance. It's about speaking and writing in compelling ways that makes decision makers want to adopt your value. And so at its core, even simply by definition, advocacy really means to be called to stand beside. And we could talk about the array of strategies to be to advocate. We can see the work being done by Unpack It. Let's Unpack It, and we understand there are many different ways to be an advocate. There's no one way. But advocacy is important because it's about change. It's about seeing an issue and deciding, I don't feel comfortable with this. This is unacceptable. I feel strongly about this. I want to create change. And for Let's Unpack It, we know that it's about mental health. It's about influence, because change comes through influence. It's about being able to cultivate enough influence that you are therefore able to say, this is the change we want. This is why we should give it to you, and mobilize persons behind that cause to really and truly get the change that you want. It's about partnership, because we can't do anything alone. The best advocacy strategies involve communities. They involve various interest groups. They involve persons who come from different backgrounds. They involve several agencies. So because it means that not only are you able to mobilize more, but when you speak, you are representative of a larger cross-section of people. And it's about a voice. Now, I am at the stage of my journey where I no longer believe that advocacy is about being a voice for other people. In the sense that I don't believe, and it's a quote that says, no one is voiceless, they're just silenced. And so for advocates, advocacy is about sometimes saying the things that people are unwilling to say. It is about saying the things that persons may not know how to say, and it is about speaking in rooms that you exist in that other persons may not be able to enter into. But in reality, anybody can be an advocate. And so advocacy is a tool for every and anybody. And it becomes important because persons who did not have a voice, who did not have a platform, can now get one because they recognize an issue, they want to change it, they're willing to work towards having the influence, and they believe in the partnership. And here it says advocacy is a great tool, but you have to carefully consider when it can achieve the best results. And so Michael Pertruck says, advocates are unabashed tellers of truth to power who operate outside of conventional political or other establishments. They may often be irritating and difficult, but they churn up our collective conscience and annoy us into action. And this quote is really about advocates speaking truth to power. And the Mr. Applewhite mentioned that, it is about being willing to say things and standing regardless of what the results are, what the reactions are. So advocates often put a lot of risk. There's a lot of risk in advocacy simply because the reaction that you might get may not be favorable. So obviously, if you are speaking about, let us say, LGBTQ rights in a country that is opposed to the entire community, then you're going to have a different reaction. And in some political cultures, persons may argue even in the Caribbean culture and within Barbados, you can find yourself blacklisted and those different things. But at the center of advocacy and the reason for starting an organization really and truly is to speak truth to power, and oftentimes to go up against establishments that may not support you. And it also is about raising awareness in communities that really may not be interested in hearing the message that you want to bring. It's about being able, even in the face of opposition, to speak boldly and to speak loudly. And Mr. Applewhite once again mentioned being a bold leader or needing a bold leader. And so when you're starting an organization, it is really important to know what is the story that you are telling. What is the issue that you are seeking to change? And in starting that organization with advocacy, you also need to understand what policy is, because ultimately at its core, advocacy is about creating policy changes. And policy is a planned course of action which links problems to solutions. And advocacy is all about generating solutions. The aim of policy is to provide a guide which informs people of how something should be carried out and the expected result. Policy can be used by government, communities, industries, and individuals. Although we may not notice it, policy affects most aspects of our lives as it often guides the actions that we take. And so when we speak about policy, policy isn't simply, for example, legislation, but policy would be simple things. So for example, but meaningful things, and it means a lot to communities. So for example, if we look at the Muslim community and the advocacy that they've done, and I think it was last year, women who are Muslim were able to advocate, particularly at Barbados Association of Muslim Ladies, and to be able to wear their hijab and religious headguards while taking their identification photos when previously it was to be removed. While that may not have been a huge legislative policy that was debated in Parliament, it was a policy that meant a lot because it respected the religious rights and freedoms of the Muslim community. Also, you can consider other things like policies on whether or not boys should be able to wear their hair braided to school, or whether or not a mustache or a beard is untidy. The frontal label policy that says that we have to display nutritional information at the front of containers, all of those different things. Those are policy decisions. And sometimes we don't notice how they impact our ability to move daily, but we have to decide as well, what is the policy? What is it exactly that we want to change? And policy is designed to address certain things. So when basic needs are not being met and people are being treated unfairly, policies or laws currently in place are not being enforced, or they're not effective. So we know, and I am sure that Let's Unpack It can delve into how there are policies or laws in place for mental health that are outdated, they're not enforced, and they're definitely not effective. And I said outdated, which brings to the next point, that it's outdated and not reflective of contemporary needs, because we know when our policies were drafted. And or another thing is that an existing condition poses a threat to the well-being of a community or the population as a whole. And we can look around within our various interest groups and what we feel passionate about. And even if we don't stay right here in Barbados right now, and we want to shift our view to the United States, Roe versus Wade is an emerging condition that poses a threat to the well-being of a community or the population as a whole. And so if you're talking about creating and changing policy, then and being an advocate and starting an organization, it is important to know which policy you are going to change. And let me just say, feel free to jump in at any time. I'm trying to also follow in the chat what's going on, but I would love for you guys to engage as we are going and to ask any questions. Now, when you're starting the organization, knowing exactly when to employ policy change through advocacy is necessary, but it can be tricky because sometimes advocacy may not be the most appropriate strategy, and starting an advocacy organization may not be the best idea. And so, for example, let's just say you have 16 organizations who are working in mental health, and they're doing it in specific ways. And you have a thought to create an organization that does the exact same thing, the exact same way. What may happen is that when there's so much information happening, people log out, they get irritated, they have an overload, and they stop listening. But if you are coming with a new and innovative idea, new and innovative way to have the discussion, to share that education, then people are going to pay attention. And so while there may have been many organizations and many persons talking about mental health advocacy and mental health as a whole, if we're being honest, and personally for me, Let's Unpack It has done that in a very innovative and very interesting way. And so there's a lot of interest in the work being done by Let's Unpack It and Let's Unpack It. So when is advocacy best? Promoting public objectives, to overcome barriers that limit opportunities, to promote the importance and relevance of various issues, to create a coalition of like-minded partners, to protect human rights, and to ensure a better quality of life, be oriented towards outcomes for development, to aim for empowerment of disadvantaged individuals and groups, and to challenge stereotypes and stigma. So when we're looking here, are you seeking to do any of the things that are listed here as you start your new organization? And if you are, then advocacy is best in this situation. But also consider, are there organizations doing the kind of work I want to do, the way I want to do it? Can I become a partner? Can I join an organization to push the objectives that they have? Or am I seeking to reinvent the wheel? And oftentimes we want to say, no, I did this, I founded this, I created this, all those different things. But it's really important to know whether or not you as an organization will be seeking to divide and at BYDC, Bible Youth Development Council, this is one of the things that we often say to partners. Is there any potential to work together to ensure the best utilization of scarce resources? Or really and truly, are we seeking to divide resources? And the truth is that when you're starting an organization, it's very important to consider the resources available to you. And financial resources aren't the only kind of resources that you need. So do you have persons to participate? What are your sponsors going to be willing to donate in kind? Are your facilitators going to feel burnout? Are you bringing new facilitators or the same facilitators over and over and over again? Are people going to get tired of hearing these voices? And for me, as someone who is a facilitator, like, sometimes I am very concerned that people are very much tired of hearing my voice over and over and over. And so as an organization, those are the kind of things that you have to consider. So what are the benefits of advocacy? You're producing positive changes in legislation, policies, practices, service delivery and development, community behaviors and attitude. You're promoting action and resilience in communities in conjunction with healthy behavior, because what you really want to do is change things for the better, to empower citizens to become more actively involved in decision-making and broader policy development. So you want persons to be more involved in the democratic process, because oftentimes we think about democracy as only happening for elections, and you want them to be more involved and to raise awareness of the significant impact on populations of various social factors, and to facilitate systematic change in these areas, because you don't want to change it today and then tomorrow it goes back the same. I'm certain the goal of Let's Unpack It is not for us to say, okay, so tomorrow's mental health day, and then the next day we go back to telling people to work extra hard, to ignore burnout, not recognizing depression and all of those different things. Absolutely not. What we really and truly want is for there to be a change that is so far-reaching, so widespread, so long-lasting that we never have to necessarily have the discussion and start from the base again. So I go back to Roe versus Wade, because for me, particularly as it relates to gender, it's a very strong topic. Now, the advocacy around Roe versus Wade, or the reason that Roe versus Wade occurred when it was decided, was very important. And most people, that was a systematic change based on that ruling, in a way that while there was opposition still to abortions and access to safe abortions, there was a change that said you had access. Now, as we come back to it about 50 years on, we're at a point where you're going to have to start to work on this systematic change all over. So one of the things about advocacy that is very important to remember is that while you may achieve an outcome, you still have to keep moving it forward, because what was acceptable 10 years ago as a certain policy, as we get more ideas and more involved and more progressive as society, it is going to change, because we're going to learn new terms, we're going to have more information available to us. And so that brings me to, when you are starting an organization, the kind of skills that you need, because in order to start an organization, in order to be an advocate, you have to be able to, once again, inspire and influence not only people, but governments and those different things to action. And so the kind of things that you are considering, are you a good communicator? Advocates have to be very good communicators. We have to be able to speak to every single population, every single person. So that means you have to speak to the policymaker who understands jargon, and the person who just genuinely is not interested, and you have to be able to make them interested. And so one of the things that I tell persons when I'm coaching them for public speaking is simply your message, if it is not understandable to every person in your crowd, and that might be a crazy thing to measure it, but I don't know if Ms. Appleby agrees, But if you're not able for everyone in the crowd to understand your message, then you have not communicated well. For the simple fact that you want everybody to leave with your call to action and with your message in mind. And so as an advocate, you have to know how to give a message to students, and you have to know how to give a message to a high-level panel of ministers and policymakers and all those different things. You need to be knowledgeable. You can't talk to people and ain't know what you're talking about. You cannot simply pull information and things out of the air. It is no longer possible for you to, it's no longer, am I reading the right? Sorry, guys. I keep pressing the button. Sorry. Right. So you need to be knowledgeable. You need to know the statistics. You need to understand why things are the way they are. Because trust and believe, if you are promoting one thing, somebody is promoting the exact opposite. So Let's Unpack It is saying we need to focus on mental health. And some people are saying this generation too soft. When back in the day, I used to do all of these things and I would feel like sad sometimes. But the truth is that I would push through. Let's Unpack It is saying we need to take a moment to consider this because this has disastrous effects for the productivity of our society and their well-being. And other people are saying otherwise. You need to be a good networker so that you can build partnerships and collaborations. You need to be tenacious. Now, you need to know when to cope with negative responses. You need to know how to respond, and you need to understand when it is negative feedback that you should dismiss and feedback that you need to take on and that makes you better. But advocacy, and I say this from personal experience, it is not a kind journey. It is not one that is forgiving, and it requires that you dig deep and that you engage with your tribe and your support system to do better. Be a storyteller. In order to tell people what's going on, to interest them, you need to be able to weave, and it goes back to communication. You need to be able to reach them, to tug at their heartstrings, to engage them in different ways. So you have to know how to use your words to not offend, but to spread the message. You have to know when to use facts, not too much, but just enough so that you have evidence, as well as when to be anecdotal, when to tell your personal story. Nobody wants to hear about you all the time. And last but not least, as an advocate, you need to be passionate and persistent. For advocacy, passion will lend to your persistence when you are completely tired of saying the same thing over and over. When you feel like your message isn't hitting where it should, when you feel like people aren't listening and you're wasting your time, that is where passion and those things comes in. And the final thing that I want to say before I hand back over to Chelsea and everyone else, how do you stop this? All right. The final thing that I do want to say is when we talk about starting organizations, the why is super important. And so recently I went to Rwanda and I got this book and it's called Everyday Ubuntu. And I've seen Ubuntu a bunch of times, but it talks about how deeply intertwined our level of satisfaction and our quality of life is in the well-being of others. And if you are starting an organization, it is about service. It is not about self. It is not about personal gratification. It is not about the awards and the accolades. It is really about how can I add value to my community to make it better? And so I would love, and I'll probably share more on my social media about Ubuntu in itself, but knowing that I am because you are. And it is central to organizations. Mr. Applewhite, Carl talked about team building and the dynamic. That is important. And so as a person, if you start or join an organization for advocacy, it is important to introspect and to stay grounded. Because if you are not grounded, if you lose sight of the vision, you are not going to share the message that you need to share. And so that is really everything that I have to say this afternoon. Well, not everything, there's so much, but that is really the gist of what I have to say based on the time that I've been given. So thank you once again for listening. And if you have any questions or queries or comments, just feel free to share. But Chelsea, David, right back over to you.
Thanks so much, Roshana. Indeed, another very insightful session here. And just thank you for really elaborating on what advocacy is and kind of setting that tone. I think certainly for us at Let's Unpack It, we've gone through the phases of kind of defining what are our goals and our key objectives and these kind of things. But perhaps the first question I could ask to you, Roshana, is how do you go about defining that why? And perhaps you could talk a little bit about how long should a person discuss, sit down and really reflect on this idea. I know certainly in our society right now, there's this hustle culture. There's this go get it, do this, do that. There's little talked about, spending time with that idea and really honing it. So could you tell us a little bit about what else goes into defining that why and kind of probably getting it down on paper, these kind of things?
Sure. So I'm going to be anecdotal here because like I said, I've been doing advocacy for a while. And so I am at the point where I am shifting out, particularly from youth advocacy. That's a difficult decision, but the why for me is important. Why youth advocacy? Why this particular thing? What next? And so when you think about what your why is, so we pick a cause, we pick any cause. Let's use something like, let's go to mental health. So we choose mental health as the reason, the cause. So then we say to ourselves, we really want to start something around mental health, but we need to have the basics down. Why mental health? So as a team, we come together and we say, these are the 4 reasons. There are 4 team members. Each of us gives a reason. Each of us gives a why. And as we look through it, we realize that in our whys, some of these things overlap and they're redundant, but also it's not clear. And going back to Mr. Applewaite's presentation, he talked about SMART goals. At the start of the organization, it is important to have SMART goals because it is important to understand what you are setting out to do and why you are setting out to do it. And can it be reached? Is it something that can occur? So for example, you'll have organizations and they'll say their goal is something like, let's say, for example, to achieve world domination in 10 years. Is this possible? Or for example, eradicating violence against women. That's ambitious, but whether or not it's possible is another thing. And so your organization has to be able to communicate very clearly why it's doing what it's doing to everyone and sit with it. Now, I mentioned that I was leaving advocacy because one of the things I did, I took a sabbatical from a lot of things. This is probably my first presentation in like 2 or 3 months. And the reason for that is because I wanted to take time to figure out what happens next. And the same applies to organizations. I don't know that there is particularly a period of time, so 6 months, a year, or any of those different things that there's a time frame for you. But what I would say is that you need to test as well your why with people. So I'm starting an organization for women's leadership. When I tell people what my why is, do they say, okay, that's a great idea? Or do they say, but isn't there something like that already? Do they say, okay, we definitely need that? Or do they say, even if you have to clarify, after clarifying your why, do they say, yes, I'm joining? Or do they simply say, okay, that's interesting, And it's not to say that because people don't necessarily see your vision not to do it, but it is to say that you have to, similar to a business, it's very important to understand what your market needs and what your target audience needs. Where are you advocating on behalf of people? Sorry, Kobe telling me to come out his slides. So I'll finish here. Where are you advocating on behalf of persons or saying that you are a voice for people when what you are asking for is not what they want? So I say the time that it takes or the time period should be long enough for you to get in touch with your audience, understand what they want, understand what you can deliver so that you understand how you add value to this community. Sorry, Kobe.
I think that really sets up the platform for his presentation. Kobe, that's less work for you. Why are you complaining? Thanks so much for answering that one, Trim. My next question really goes into this idea of energy and motivation. I know certainly for Let's Unpack It, we've been doing this for 2 years and we've seen our team has grown even. But yeah, there are times where we kind of wonder, okay, do we personally have the energy for this? And where is the community that we're targeting at this point? In terms of, are they being oversaturated with information? Is there a lot going on and so on? Can you talk a little bit, and perhaps this is again bordering into Kobe's area, but I think the idea of being one-at-one with your audience and recognizing where they're at. Do you have any kind of personal experiences with that?
Absolutely. So as everybody knows, and that's a really good question. So the first thing that I want to say is sometimes in organizations, we have to create our own energy and we have to push each other. Youth leadership, youth advocacy, whatever you wish to call it, it can get extremely lonely and it can feel as though you are working in vain. So for example, there are many times where I just question, or I have questioned, why am I doing this? Does this make sense? Particularly because sometimes you are doing the best you can in spaces, and then you come out of that and you go on like social media and thing, and people are like, oh, you're not doing enough. Oh, this is what we want. And it's like, but I just talked about this in my meeting. I just said this, you know? And so you have to create your own tribe, your own system of support. So for example, for me, it is BYDC, it is Kobe, it is Jamila, it is a group of people who are involved in advocacy as well. Sometimes your community, sometimes persons are asking for something, but they won't show up for it, which makes it difficult for us as advocates to push it through. So for example, there was a time that I was doing a session, I was in a meeting with the Ministry of Youth, with directors and different things. And one of the things that we were talking about would be the National Youth Service that was proposed in 2011. And while I was in the meeting, they're saying, you know, we need a National Youth Service, we need to push this. And I said, but no, you can't force people to volunteer. That's not volunteerism. And they say, and they start to go off, as older persons sometimes do, about back in my day. And I roll my eyes because I really get tired of hearing that. And but one of the things they said to me is, you're saying all of this. Where are all the young people who are saying all of these things? Where are all the young people who you are speaking on behalf of? And I'm like, they're on social media talking, like they're speaking. But then you do something like you have a town hall, or you have a Zoom call, or you do something and people don't show up. So even if you look at when we were thinking about taking on Nelson, there was so much support on social media. But when we went to the protests, where are the people? Why don't we have the hundreds who said that they were supporting? And so it is important as to not be doing this for anybody else but you. Your advocacy has to be for someone. It has to be about something. But you can't be doing it for validation or gratification from someone else. Because if you do, you are going to run out of steam. The last thing I want to say on this point, because I think I answered everything, is you have to give yourself grace and space. COVID-19 was such an awful thing for me personally. because I was working in a job in social development, dealing with a lot of people who were exceptionally vulnerable. I was the chairperson of CRIC at the time, Caribbean Regional Youth Council, and I was still president of BYDC. And when COVID hit, when it hit like early 2021, I was gone. I was completely out, and I was completely I was done. And I was so unforgiving with myself because I felt like for somebody who was high functioning, who was always on projects, who was always in committees, who was always in meetings, I felt like I was failing my team. I had Zoom fatigue. My mind wasn't there. I just didn't want to do anything. And it's only recently I started to get back into things. And I had Zoom fatigue. And I was so angry with myself. And I kept pushing through. And for me, with that frustration, I realized that if Kobe or Khadija or even Chelsea or you yourself, David, came and y'all asked me, Trim, what am I to do? I would say, take a break. I would say, breathe. I would say, rest. I would say, you are too hard on yourself. And so when we don't feel like we have the energy, sometimes it means that we need to step back. We need to take a moment to process, figure out what our why is, remember what our why is, and give ourselves the same grace and space that we would give others. Mr. Applewave asks, I think it's him, is it that we don't advertise enough and reach enough audiences? And yes, this is also one of the challenges. But for youth organizations, the big challenge is that we don't necessarily have the amount of capital or funds to push in the same way as a business or a larger organization we're back in. So for BYDC, or CRIC, as a youth, as somebody who's been in the field and who's been chairperson and president, the amount of money that I have put into youth organizations, I'm very sure that I could have bought a house and land by now, And so, but we have to know how to do it in a way that's smart. We have to know how to connect with the right partners. And we have to make messages that matter to people and that resound with people. And that comes back to communication. Because for me, when Let's Unpack It posts, it's like, okay, here's a tape. Okay, I needed this quote. Okay, let's go. And it's so quick and easy. On the other hand, sometimes we're posting statuses and it's all of this information. Nobody's going to read that. I'm very sorry, but we are not a reading society anymore. And we have to accept that and deliver information in a way that matters. So, Kobe, so yes, so that's absolutely part of the reason as well. And also, shameless plug, BYDC is going to be hosting a session on advertising and marketing and branding on social media for organizations, because that's very important. How do we reach our audience in a virtual space and competing with so much happening?
That's so good, Roshana. There's so much information that you packed into the answer of that question. And I think one of my biggest takeaways is this whole idea of grace and space. And you gave your own analogy of how you tell people all these things. You're there for your friends, you show up for other people, but are you showing up for yourself? I think that's super important in terms of the longevity of an organization even, and even your energy and motivation. I do have one more question for you, and perhaps we need to do a whole discussion on this, but I wonder if you could just give us in a brief response, how do you take your advocacy initiative, say for instance, Let's Unpack It, we're trying to bring home this message about mental health, making it a priority. How do we move from there to sitting at the table with policymakers who can actually help us make the changes that we want to see? Tell us a little bit about that process.
Okay, so that's a very good question. And so how do you move from shouting outside the room to being at the table? And the answer is not to lift at the table, Kobe, but it is to become hyper visible and to start to reach out to ministers and the policy makers that you need, the partners that you need. And so, for example, Let's Unpack It once again. You're speaking about mental health. And so you know that you already have an audience. You've done your research. You started to post your research on social media. You're gaining traction. And so then what you do is that you take that up a notch. Do you have a policy paper? What are the changes that you want in black and white. If it's not in black and white, it does not exist. And so what are the changes you want in black and white? Where is the evidence to back this up? And if you're speaking to policymakers, advocates, we like to appeal to common decency and humanity, and that's great. But policymakers are looking for a return on investment. So what does it cost us to have a population that is mentally unhealthy? What does it cost us to have one that prioritizes health? And what does that look like? Are there case studies? So you've created your case, and now you're thinking about your ministers, you're thinking about those other stakeholders, PAHO, whoever that may be, because you've compiled a list of your stakeholders. And you start to share that. But at the same time, you're still keeping your audience and still showing that you're working in the community. And so what you do is, for example, we think things like summits and conversations and all of those things, they can feel superficial. But are you hosting them, and are you partnering with these organizations so they know what you are doing? Are you sending out email blasts? Are you writing newspaper articles? Are you riling people up? Are you calling into brass tacks? So you're moving beyond internally, this is what we want, and saying, yeah, so this is what we want, and this is what we have to give you. This is why it makes sense. This is why it matters. This is where the money is. And when you start to infiltrate all of these different spaces all together, then you start to see persons welcoming you to the table. And the truth is that if they don't bring you to the table, you create your own table and you invite them. And you do that very publicly. So for example, Let's Unpack It is having and this is where I wrap up, Let's Unpack It is having a town hall, and we're inviting the Minister of Health, we're inviting the National Task Force on Health, XYZ. Or you're doing a petition and you're sending it, you're taking it, you take a picture right outside the Ministry of Health, and you say, we're outside the Ministry of Health today with our petition, and we're really interested. And you're engaging. So you're sending emails to ministers and that kind of stuff. And when you start to do that and you're consistent in it, you should be invited to the table. And if they don't invite you to the table, as Shirley Chisholm said, bring a folding chair. So you show up to the table by making yourself extremely visible. And I want to say bordering on being a nuisance. Because when we did Protect Our Girls, I don't know if you guys remembered, if everyone remembers, but we shared the minister's email and a letter template on social media. This is after we had sent out the press release and emailed him personally ourselves. And then we went into the meeting and he said, y'all made me so uncomfortable because people were emailing every single day. They were calling, they were delivering letters to the office, those kind of things. So you got to know initially, as an advocate, you use honey. And when the honey don't work, it's time for the lime. And that's really just what it is.
That's so good. And that will definitely be our takeaway from this whole presentation, Roshana. Thank you so much for the wealth of information that you've shared with us. We're definitely going to be harassing you to come back and share some more insight into the fundamentals of advocacy and really moving the projects along. Thank you again for availing yourself, even though you were unwell. And so, yeah, I'm sure everybody just please put some cheers and some applause in the chat to thank Roshana and certainly Carl as well. Thanks so much. Chelsea, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Trim, for your presentation. Now to our last presenter, Mr. Kobe Brooms. Kobe is an innovative and forward-thinking professional with proven success managing social media strategies and engaging audiences to elevate brand messaging and establish a loyal customer base. He has worked at the 2 leading media houses in Barbados in both the editorial and sales departments, where he honed the abilities in social media marketing and brand promotion. He is well-versed in monitoring social media activity and creating content to engage consumers and stakeholders via social networks and traditional mediums. He has also spearheaded social media campaigns to create customer engagement and digital communication initiatives for numerous brands. As an experienced social media practitioner for over 7 years, with over 7 years of experience, he is well versed in media relations, marketing communications, public relations, and media planning. Over to you, Mr. Brooms.
Hello, everybody. Just making sure that you can hear me.
5 out of 5.
All right, fantastic. All right, good afternoon, everybody, on this blessed Sunday afternoon. Before we get into my presentation, I just want to say thank you, David and Chelsea, and the rest of the Let's Unpack It team for having me here this evening to share a little bit about you and share some with you, insight with you about branding for youth organizations. Before I get into my presentation, I just want to say I'm very well put together summit, if I would say, Chelsea and David. The information from Mr. Applewhite straight through to Roshana coming right into what I have to discuss with you today is extremely important, and even how you put it together, it's all going to come together. So as I was listening to Mr. Applewhite and Roshana, and what I have prepared for you now, you're going to see how everything now comes together, because the first thing you have to do is to look at your team, build your team. The second thing you have to do is to prioritize, what is this team going to be doing? What is our vision? What is our goals? And then the third thing that you have to do is to understand and build your brand, build what you're going to be known for in this space, right? So one of the things that I haven't recognized before getting is that everybody in this space has been very, very quiet. And you know, Chelsea and David, I do not do quiet. I don't do quiet. So my presentation is extremely interactive. So put yourself in a position that you can answer some of my questions, and we're going to get right to it. All right, so recommended approach for brand development for youth organizations. So the first question I want to ask somebody in the audience is, when you hear brand development, when you hear brand on a whole, what are you thinking about? What is the first thing that comes to mind?
When I hear brand, my mind automatically goes to like Apple, right?
Okay.
And so that's where I kind of formulate my response from. And then, just how, it may have gone from like an iPod and it would have developed, no pun intended, so, you have the iPads, the laptops, the phones, the AirPods, the AirTags, everything. So that is kind of like how I see it, you elevating, expanding, and while still keeping your audience that you would have had, when you had just the iPod.
Okay. All right. So you're saying Apple, the brand. Okay. All right. We'll put a pin in that one. Anybody else? When you see a brand or when you think about a brand, what do you think about?
I just want to tag on to what Chelsea said, and I think it's really the myriad of things that you do to identify yourself. So I think of things like a logo, things like the choice of words, things like when you put out a poster that people immediately know that's you versus somebody else, these kind of things.
I was glad that you said that, David, because that is how majority of people feel, and that is absolutely incorrect. That is absolutely incorrect. So what is branding? Branding is not the same as logo making. Branding is not just how things look. Branding is not the same thing as advertising. Branding is not the same as marketing. Branding is not just for big companies, but what branding is that it adds value. It does affect sales in some instances, and branding should not wait. So I say all that to say, yes, you guys have this nice logo behind your on your Zoom platform, but that isn't branding. That is a part of branding. That is an element of it, but it is not specifically branding. So things to consider as we go through this process, because we all, in terms of when we're looking at an organization or when we're looking to get into the space, there are things that we have to do in order to set ourselves apart. So what are some of those things? There are originally 7 P's, but I've just brought them down to 6. Purpose, philosophy, forgive me, I can't ever get that word pronounced, proof, and patronage, and the pipeline, right? So what are the things that your stakeholders should consider? You have to consider your purpose when you are setting up an organization. You have to have your aim, motto, vision. What are you all about? Because if you don't know what you are all about, how are you going to tell somebody else what you're all about? So your brand has to encompass all of these things. Is there a distinct purpose or societal benefit for the existence of this brand? How can your brand purpose be leveraged as a unique value proposition for potential participants to embrace and for its stakeholders to benefit from it? And is that brand built on a purpose that is sustainable? So those were a lot of questions there. When you're looking at an organization, especially a new organization, or if you've just joined one and you're looking to push it forward, you have to do that reflections. And I think that was mentioned earlier, to answer all of these questions. Because again, you internally, as a team, you have to be clear on what it is you want to do. Because if you are not clear as to what your goal is, what your end goal is, what your milestones are, then the public is going to be confused. So whether you have the best logo, whether you have the best graphics on social media, if you don't know what your purpose is, you're going to be forever going around in circles. So those are some of the questions that you need to ask yourself. In terms of philosophy, what is your brand philosophy and ideology that potential participants can buy into and align themselves with? So what do you stand for? So let's unpack it. What is your philosophy? Your philosophy is that mental health matters. Everybody should pay attention to their mental health. So how can people buy into that and align themselves toward that? Those are some of the things you have to consider when you're building out your brand. And what is the appeal about you that will make them gravitate toward your content more so than others who may be in the market? Or what is your unique value proposition into the market? So we've heard mental health before. We see it every year when it's mental health month. People from time to time come up. So why should I listen to you? Are you just making noise in the space? What is your philosophy? What is your purpose? This word that ties up my tongue. What are your ideal target audiences? And this is a question that came up a bit earlier, where there may be a call to action, but then you don't get a lot of support, or you may be targeting your own audiences. And then one of the things that I find that we make assumptions about is that something that we are comfortable with, our philosophy, or our idea, we sometimes push that on to what we're doing. And we don't necessarily ask the persons who we are representing or who we are building content for, or building our brand for. What do they want? What are their needs? What are their aspirations? How will we profile their behaviors and interests to help drive participation? What do we need to make them think? Know, express, act upon as it relates to your brand. So how do you get into the minds of those persons? How do you get them to interact with you? How do those are the questions that you have to ask yourself, because developing a brand, as I said, and I will continue to say, David, is not a logo, is not posters. You have to ask yourself these hard questions, because whenever somebody asks you, what do you stand for? You need to be able to stand up with your chest and say, these are the principles on which Let's Unpack It is built. These are the principles on which BYDC is built. These are the principles on which, your organization stands for. Because without that, you're like a rudderless ship. The proof. Now, the old people have a saying, the proof is in the pudding. How can you show a proof of concept and expertise that will show that you are a credible brand? So as Roshana was mentioning just now, her organization or her group had some advocacy with the GIS issue. How do you show that you have credibility as a brand? What will make your brand story believable and compelling? So if you're pitching to, let's say, IDB or CDB for funding, what are some of the tangible things that you can point and show that I can get this executed? We have the necessary expertise, we have the necessary willpower, we have the volunteers, we have the manpower. You have to show what those metrics are internally, that you can get this project undertaken. That, even if it is that you start with something small and you say, well, as our first milestone, we want to do an online summit. The second milestone, we want to do it in person. The third milestone, we want to hold it nationally. The fourth milestone is a regional. So when you look at that, if I'm going to somebody and saying to myself, or I want to say, okay, I want some funding, I can say, well, I did the first one successfully. I did the second one successfully. Come and join us for the third, fourth, and fifth. So the proof is in the pudding. The patronage. How can we cultivate a community of advocates and fans of your organizations? So these questions, as you start to think about it, you should be putting some answers down to say, how am I going to get support for a particular initiative? How am I going to get a disengaged set of young people who may just come on Twitter and rant to actually to call them to action, to show them? So let's say I plan a protest. Are they going to come out to a protest? No. Will they sign a petition? Maybe. So how do I cultivate, how do I form strategic alliances? And this goes back to Roshana's point about networking and advocacy, with other persons who can speak well of me, who can mention my name in rooms that, unlike my approach, you don't kick down the table, you get that invitation because you are able to, you've been able to build such a brand on all of these pillars that you have here in terms of your purpose, your philosophy, your proof, so that then we go to the 6P, which is the pipeline. How can your group continue to attract participation and create future demand to support your long-term goals? Because you know what happens in organizations, the founders come, the first set of members go, life happens, things happen, people may no longer be interested, people may no longer have time. So what happens then? Let's say David is in medical school, he becomes a doctor, he starts rounds, he has no time for Let's Unpack It. Does the organization die with David? Or are we creating enough interest and participation to create a future demand of persons who can take up and say, all right, David, go save lives. We continue to focus on mental health. So those are the things that you have to think about when you are developing a brand, right? So before I go on, I see some messages popping in. Just going to see what's happening. Yes, exactly. Succession plan is important. All of these things are very much important when you are developing a brand. So purpose, philosophy, proof, patronage, pipeline. Any questions so far before I move on? Am I making sense? Or am I just,
So much sense. I don't think anyone has any questions at this point, Kobe.
All right, very well. So those are the things you have to consider. And one of the other things that I would want you to consider as well, when you're going through or identifying these 6 pillars that I've outlined to you, is that you have to go through a certain set of stages. One of the things that sometimes people have is a big idea, but the idea is only an idea. To put it into practice, when you start to do research, you may find, all right, let's give an example. If I want to start a food critique business, if I wanted to start selling fish and chips, I use fish and chips. And I say, okay, I want to do this because when I am at home on a Saturday night, I can't find anywhere in my immediate circle to find fish and chips. You have to then determine, by which will be stage 1 in terms of discovery, is it sustainable that I may have 10 people that live around me, but just down the gap is another store? Are these 10 people going to support me? Is this going to be a worthwhile thing? My big idea is that I meet a demand that I think is there, but I have no to research to find out if that demand is just what I think it is, or if there is actually a market for it. So I use that example of fish and chips. For advocacy, I can say there is a demand in youth for youth representation or having this youth voice on this particular issue. And it may just be within 5 persons or a small circle. Not to say that you aren't going to advocate for smaller groups, But the other thing, I made that point to show the larger issue that you have to do research. So before you are looking to execute any project, or before you're looking to execute or act on an idea, you have to go through that stage of discovery. It is imperative that your branding process start with exploration and discovery. This approach is needed to inform the situational analysis for brand positioning opportunities and also to uncover critical insights that will help to delineate the brand position. During the discovery stage, you'll begin to unearth what we call the brand why. So what your purpose is based on those introspective questions that I have outlined. And I think Roshana kind of touched on it a little bit more. What, how, and why? What are your key components of the product development? What does the brand represent and how does it differ from others? What do the internal and external stakeholders believe about your brand? These are all important questions because these all go toward your brand development. How? How should it be positioned? So how am I going to position this? Am I going to position myself as a thought leader? Am I going to position myself as giving advice? Am I going to position myself as advocacy? Am I just going to be an information hub? Am I just going to share tips? What do I want to do with this platform after? How should I communicate it and demonstrate it in its unique value proposition and expertise as a brand? So am I saying Let's Unpack It is the premier place for mental health tips? Or am I saying Let's Unpack It is a place that, that we offer advice? Not saying that you do, but just for example purposes. Are there any unique methodologies, proprietary system, trade secrets, etc., to be considered for your thought leadership? These are all questions that you have to ask yourself because others may be doing it in the space. You have to make yourself different. Because one of the things that I would tell you in advertising when we do creating campaigns for companies, there's a lot out there trying to grab your attention. So you always have to, in a sense, try to be different. What is going to make you stop dead in your tracks to say, well, this is interesting. Let me take a bit of my time to read through this. Roshana mentioned it when she said there may be some engaging posts that stop you and then others that may have a lot of text. What we found now is that social media platforms are pushing you away from photos to reels and videos. So how have you as a brand or how have you as an organization adapted your social media strategy to keep in line with what is happening? Are you finding that your content is still resonating well with people? And there's scientific methods to look at it in terms of the time that you post, what type of days, when you post in terms of days, the type of content. I've been finding with so many brands that I manage that people like questions or to interact. So if you ask them, you give them a this or that, what do you prefer? Those types of content that is engaging. So all of those things go into the how. And the why. Why is a strong stakeholder-focused brand pivotal at this point? What are the key outcomes that this branding program needs to achieve? So what are your KPIs? So as Roshana rightfully said, somebody may say to end domestic violence or to ensure that everybody knows about therapy. That is an overarching and very broad-based goal, but what are your milestones to get there? What are you putting in place in your brand to ensure that you are on the right track in terms of project planning? So you don't just set of course, in terms of strategic planning, you set a broad goal, but you also, in terms of that process, you need to set those smaller milestones to ensure that you're on the right track. And in that process, have those evaluations. So if I'm looking to launch a summer campaign for Let's Unpack It, what are the outcomes that I'm looking for? Am I looking for, if I'm speaking strictly from a brand perspective, I'm looking for 200 leads. I'm looking for 200 signups. I'm looking for 10 people to join my team. I'm setting these particular goals so that you're able to measure the success of a particular initiative so that you are able then to go back to the drawing board and say, not just based on because people say, oh, this was such a good event, It was very well put together, but I absolutely left when I ate my Sunday food, sleep, and I forgot everything Mr. Alpaway, Roshana, and Kobe said. So you have to have those metrics in place, your KPIs, to determine the success of your campaigns and also to keep you accountable, to keep you on track, to be able to show you what you have to do, and when you have those post-mortem meetings, and I know, David, you asked that question earlier, a lot goes into project planning as well. And as I was mentioning earlier, you can decide with the team, we're going to have a quarterly half-day meeting. In that half-day meeting, we're going to plan our broad topics for January, February, March. We're going to assign persons to those topics, and then what will happen is, instead of doing a meeting, we're just going to do a round robin via email just to remind everybody of what's happening, and do a monthly or bi-weekly check-in just to see where you're at, status, so on. So you're able, because people are busy, of course, to keep tabs on everything that is happening, and also that you're able to set those strategic goals. And it makes it, because of course it's a voluntary organization, you don't feel as overwhelmed because you have a little bit more time. I don't want to say time, but in terms of planning, you're able to keep on track of your deadlines and so on a little bit better. One of the critical things is, let me just see, I see a couple comments. Okay. So one of the critical things that you have to look at is benchmarking your current brand against relevant benchmarks. So your competitors, your competitions, those are the persons who you would probably want to be like. So is there another organization doing what you want to do? Is there another organization, it may not even have to be locally, but internationally, that is doing the type of stuff that you want to do, that you can say, okay, this is where we want to get to ideally. What are the steps we're going to put in place to get there? So benchmarking, and of course, you would then also have to know your limitations as well and so on. But of course, it's always good to be aspirational. This will allow you to be more informed in areas of required analysis and assessment, and therefore providing a more conclusive indication of your SWOT and situational analysis, which will inform the brand identity development brief. Because when you finish going through this process, there should be a document that spells out specifically who you are, your organizational document, your brand, what we stand for, what we're doing. And of course, that has to include the SWOT and what is happening currently, what has caused you, what the background, in a sense, for your situational analysis. So stage 2, which would be to clarify. So after you've gone through that process of discovery and research, you have to clarify it. This allows you to dive deeper into more in-depth stakeholder insights, and through what I would recommend, a branding workshop, to distill those findings into their SWOT and situational analysis, as well as to clarify your unique process methodologies, which will allow you to identify areas of strength, weakness, as well as critical gap areas that may need to be addressed during brand development and ideation. So that is a lot of words just to simply say, this is your refining process. This is where you go through all the information, the engagement that you've gotten from your publics in terms of asking them what do they want, how can you then tailor your organization to meet that demand, and also engaging with a sample group, maybe a focus group of those persons, to see how you can best refine your process to be able to meet that demand. So after you've done that, you have to position yourself. So data, insights, and feedback from the stage 1 and 2 will now be distilled and synthesized into supporting key messages that will inform the brand strategy and visual ideation exploration. So here we will collaborate with your key stakeholders to visually express the intangible aspects of your desired brand. Armed with your discovery, clarification, and positioning done in the earlier steps, and with the consensus, you can now co-create brand concepts that are much more descriptive, powerful, and aligned. Anybody understanding what I was meaning? Anybody wants to take a guess as to where we're going with the position? Come on, not all at once. Still processing. Okay, that's fine. It is a lot of information, and I only have done the first 5 stages because, of course, branding is an entire days of just talking. So yeah. So what this basically does from your stage 1, where you do your discovery, your stage 2 to clarify, stage 3, this is the time now that you're gonna not to position yourself into the market with all of your research done, with all the things that you know that will make you stand out. This is where you come into the logo development stage, David, and posters and all those different things about colors and brand book and all those different things. This is the stage 3 is where you're coming to that point. And stage 4 now, the co-create. Many brands make the mistake and jump straight to this stage of the process before laying the proper groundwork. So this leads to a shallow generic brand that fails to communicate and shape the desired brand essence. It also should be developed via the process of co-creation with all your key stakeholders to ensure widespread buy-in of the concepts. So this can be done through communication, construction, and cooperation. So communication, not the same as advertising, but an important policy area that should be used to get that sense of buy-in among your key stakeholders. So, you know, your planners, your project managers, what you're going to be doing, all of your internal persons and your external persons. So as I mentioned, that focus group on brand identity, design concept, messaging platforms, logos, headlines, promises. This is where we're getting to this point. The construction, which will be to collaborate on the development of real action plans and initiative to support the brand aims. So this is where you're not just looking at the logos and what you're going to look like to the public, but this is now into the nitty-gritty of when we do launch this brand or when we do launch this campaign, how is it going to work out? Hence your work plan. And the corporation, so stakeholder, cooperation, joint ventures, partnerships, cooperative co-branding programs, investment, collaborative projects that lead to tangible outcomes. So am I going to go right on it on my own? Am I going to collaborate with someone? Those are the things that you have to discuss or to be able to look at this stage in terms of your branding. And then basically stages 5 and 6, after you've gone through stage 1, discovery, stage 2, refining that process, stage 3, positioning yourself, and stage 4, starting to action, it will now be stage 5 and 6 to apply and evaluate. So if the brand concept created, if you've chosen, you're putting it all into your brand book, then you will have the measurements of evaluation and the effectiveness of the brand and its implementation. So when you put all of your plans down into this brand book and you say, okay, yes, this is where we need to go. Let's put this to action. Let's apply this. After you've done that, you always have to have a stage of evaluation to see, is this going in the right direction? What do I need to do? Am I going to, if this isn't going exactly to plan, what do I have to tweak in order to get it to the desired outcome? If nothing is working, where do I need to go back to square one to be able to understand what has happened? Am I meeting demands? But hopefully once you've done your in-depth research through stage 1, straight through to 3, you should not have that problem. Because as I mentioned for stage 4, most times people just jump straight into logo development, posters, trying to execute without doing the proper research. So that in a nutshell is overall a brand development, very, very high level in terms of just giving you a general broad sense of some of the things that you would need to do if you really want to have an organization that is not just a pretty piece of paper. It's not just, sounds good, but actually has, you put in the time, effort, and energy to make it into a sustainable or, a worthwhile venture that, of course, if you are no longer able to fulfill it, that somebody can pick up your brand book and say, okay, I see where these were going from here, and I can continue to go on. Any questions, anybody? Y'all are very quiet and it is freaking me out.
Excellent presentation, Kobe. Thank you so much. There's this welling in my chest after all the information that you've given. I now need to dissect this and go back. And certainly we do have a lot to work on at LUA in terms of filling some of these gaps. And so we may be reaching out to you, Mr. Brooms, to help us to fulfill some of these steps. But I do have 2 questions, and I do encourage anyone else who has any questions, please put them in the chat so we can get our speakers to answer for you. My first question, Kobe, is about mistakes. And you would have mentioned in terms of skipping some steps and so on, but I wonder if you could give us a little bit more insight into the organizations you've worked with or that you've seen. What are some of the common mistakes in branding and marketing? And maybe if you can tell us how to avoid them.
All right, David, good question. The most common mistake that people do is going straight to stage 4, which is, and that goes back to the point about misconceptions. People look, when they think brand, they think logo, they think assets. They think when I say assets, I mean what goes out on social media, what you look like to the public. But a brand is not, that's one part of the brand. That is like the iceberg analogy. What people see on the top, that is what people are looking at. But if you do that and you have nothing underneath, you're just extremely shallow. And this is how you found some organizations that just look good, but there's no substance when you really dig deeper. So the ways to avoid that would definitely be, before you go out on a limb to launch that stage 4, to launch the tip of the iceberg, you need to ensure that your foundation is good, because if you don't do that, then you have no vision, you have no aim, you have no purpose, you don't know who you are as a person, well, not as a person, but as an organization, and then you'll just be flapping in the wind if one thing goes well or if it doesn't go well. Because I'm sure that without naming names, people know organizations that have popped up, all hot and heavy and sweaty, where they know. You can't see them. So many times, and I'm not saying that brand is the only thing that may have caused that, but it is a good indication, because most of the times people skip those first 2 steps in research, discovery, and jump straight to logo, poster, making people feel that you look good. So my advice, always go through the steps.
I have one more question for you, and then we'll jump to the questions that are coming up in the chat. Let's talk about the Caribbean experience, because I know, for instance, when we were in our early days of Let's Unpack It, there's a wealth of information online, but not so much relevant to the Caribbean experience. For instance, I've realized in terms of like tracking some of our data on Instagram, for example, it seems very standard and it's not very curated to what we kind of see. So they'll tell you, oh, the best time to post is this time, the best time, these kind of things. Can you tell us a little bit about what are some of the things to look out for that are unique to the Caribbean, if there are any?
All right, I would say definitely messaging. Messaging is extremely important, and this is something even in Caribbean, it is a little tricky, because, like, for instance, I have a brand that I work with that has more than one territory in the Caribbean. For example, an ad campaign was developed in Trinidad, but when the campaign came here to Barbados, we had to localize it, because we understand that what Trinidadians may identify with or are comfortable with, that may not fly in the Bajan market. So I would say, even not to complicate it, but you have to look very specifically at who you are trying to attract, what they respond to well, and you tailor your content or your messaging strategy around that. Because once you've identified, I'm looking at 16 to 25 as my primary target audience, then you monitor the trends of 16 to 25 and you localize it. You are able to say, okay, well, all the people in Caribbean are talking about this. This is a common thread. This, there may be a trend that is happening. This is a common trend that goes beyond Barbados, Trinidad, Jamaica, St. Vincent. I can use this as part of my content strategy. But once you've been able to identify who your target audience is, what they're engaged with, what are they, what they're engaged with, then you're able to be more responsive to tailor your messaging execution to be able to attract those persons.
Really good. So it's a lot of work is what I'm sensing here from you, Kobe, and it's an ongoing process. You always have to revisit it and stay up to date with everything that's going on. I see
Most
two questions here in the chat, Kobe. Number one is, are all of these steps required for all types of organizations? I'm assuming that's the 6 steps that you outlined.
I would say yes. I would say yes. 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 The short answer is yes, because when you go, even if there are persons doing what you want to do, you still have to go through that process of seeing what is your unique value proposition. What are you going to bring to the market that has not been there before, or how are you going to make an impact into the area that you want to go in? And the only way that you're able to do that is to start by research and going straight through the process. But if you don't go through the process, you miss certain things that you may have to come back at a later date to try to correct.
So good. The second question I see here, Kobe, how do you get people talking about your brand? And they cited examples like Apple and Chefette and all the clout that's around these two brands. How do you get your organization to have a similar level of impact?
What I will tell you is that those brands, they didn't develop that overnight. That is something that has happened over a period of time, a long period of time. So if we take Chefette as our local example, Chefette has been built the place long, When you look back at those old Chefette ads, you see it. So if I would know, or those who pay attention would know, that Chefette only stopped advertising traditionally in terms of newspaper advertisements probably around 2011, 2012. And they went really heavy into social media, and they just do radio placements. Because at that point in time, Chefette was such a household name that it didn't make sense to them spending $5,000 on an ad. Whereas they were already developing into the social media space, and they were able to still maintain their sales, their household name. People know you don't have to sell people on going to Chefette. You just need to inform them what specials are happening. So their marketing shifted from trying to convert people, and this is something that we will look at in terms of the sales funnel, informing, attracting, getting people engaged, and then converting them to sales. They didn't need to do those two parts anymore. They just needed to make people aware of what was happening. So you have to go through the process, because up until the point where Let's Unpack It or any other youth organization is a household name, then you will have to go through the stages. And that is especially where you want a brand to get to. Apple in terms of their brand purpose, or if you look at in terms of what Apple has created in terms of an experience for their followers, is almost like when you have Apple, you're cut above the rest. The brand is marketed as an elite brand. So that is in their brand, but somewhere, because that is their purpose. That is part of the psychological impact that they want to have on their customers. So when you look at those different types of organizations that you're mentioning, Maurice, They have a brand, but they have brand guidelines. They have been able to execute. What we look at now is what I mentioned in, I think it was stage 4, is that communication is not the same thing as advertising. So they may not have to advertise, but their message has remained the same consistently because they have that brand book.
Awesome. Theory, are you trying to answer the question? No? Okay. All right. I see one more question here for you, Kobe, from Chelsea, and she asks what I think is a crucial question here. What makes partnerships and collaborations successful? And how do you set up a collaboration in a way that you won't lose your unique brand identity and message?
Chelsea, this is another presentation. This is definitely another presentation in terms of partnerships and influencer marketing and all those these different types of things. Because again, this goes back to brand, what you want to be seen in the market as, and how do you go about with collaborations that align with people that align with what you're saying, your corporate comps. So for instance, let's take for example, I was advising a client. They had an opportunity for a partnership that came in with an organization. But one of the things that I had to look at when I was doing the research to see if this was going to be viable was that, what is the perception of this person who you're hoping to collaborate with in the market? Are they known as a trustworthy person? Do they have a good public image? Do they have a good corporate image? And the answer was no. So the collaboration did not happen, because you have to align with what my philosophy is, what my brand objectives are, in order to come onto my platform or to be associated with my brand. So that in a nutshell is just an answer to that question, but it goes a lot deeper. Of course, when you look at all the different elements that go into collaborations and influencer marketing and those different types of things.
Yeah, definitely some really, really good insight into that, Kobe. Thank you so much. I don't see any more questions here. So I think that means everything has been answered. I just want to thank you on behalf of the entire Let's Unpack It team, and certainly everyone that was listening, for what was a very insightful presentation. Again, we can extract so much from this session that we need to apply to our own organization, and definitely we will be in touch with you on some of these ideas and maybe some more burning questions that we have. So thanks so much for agreeing to present, Kobe, and do take care. Yeah.
Thank you so much, David and team, for having me. And I must say that after giving you a lot of flack, your logo still certainly looks good, and you guys are doing a very good job in terms of your graphical position.
That is definitely one of the questions that we were going to ask you for a quick review of in private, but thank you for confirming in public.
No problem.
Thank you. All right, and I think next on the agenda we have Miss Shania Batiste, one of our program coordinators, and she's going to move the vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, David. Pleasant good afternoon again to our guest speakers, attendees, president and founder of Let's Unpack It, and other partners of the Let's Unpack It community. I deem it a great honor to propose the vote of thanks to all who have helped us in making episode 1 of our Youth Advocacy in Action webinar a resounding success. First of all, I would like to express my profound gratitude to senior teacher and former human resource executive, Mr. Carl Applewaite, on your thought-provoking address on team building and dynamics. To the president of the Barbados Youth Development Council and founder of Leadership Institute, Ms. Roshana Trim, a hearty thanks to you for detailing the means needed to start and effectively run a youth organization. To Mr. Kobe Brooms, former media and communications executive, thank you, sir, for gracing today's webinar with your words of wisdom on how the integration of communication and marketing is important in building a brand. Next, to our wonderful audience who attended this webinar from different parts of the world, thank you so much for attending and actively participating in this workshop. We appreciate you and hope to see you again in our future webinars. Mr. David Johnson, our president and founder of Let's Unpack It, thank you so much for your continued support and guidance towards this community and in presenting the certificates of appreciation to our distinguished speakers. Then a hearty thank you to Let's Unpack It Vice President of Operations, Ms. Chelsea Jordan, for organizing such an interesting and meaningful event. I know that all of us here gained a deeper insight and knowledge on the varying topics that were discussed. And also thanks for warmly welcoming us, leading the icebreaker and introducing our 3 speakers. And finally, to the other partners of Let's Unpack It who are here with us. That is Mr. Morris Walks, Mr. Mark Hardin, Ms. Seneri Disanayaka, Ms. Khadija Bakaria, and Ms. Lexan Douglas. Thank you all so much for volunteering your time and service and actively working in the background. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
And of course, we do want to Wrong mic. Of course, we do want to thank you too, Shania, for all the work that you've been doing. Thank you for moving this vote of thanks. And also thank you for the work that you're doing in the background to make our program move forward. I do want to invite everyone now. If you do have any other burning questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. Otherwise, this brings us to the end of this session. Thank you so much for joining. And if you'd like to stay, hang around, ask us some questions, have a chat or a laugh, you can stay with us for the next 15 minutes for our music and mingle session. Thank you and do have a wonderful week ahead. And remember that mental health is a priority and it's up to you to make it your reality. I do thank you.